This is the most important process of PC building. Picking the correct PC parts and making sure everything works together is not easy. I'm going to go through each component and I'm going to tell you what it is, and I'm going to tell you what to look for when picking each component to make sure it's all compatible with each other. And this is going to be a high level overview. We're not going to get too advanced. So first of all, you're going to have a budget, either from saving, you have a certain X amount of dollars you're going to spend, or you're going to basically try and hit some specs of like, I want to play Call of Duty at 1440p with 144 frames per second. There are many ways of hitting those specs, so research some YouTube videos and see what kind of components they're using to hit those, and that can kind of be like a good baseline of where you want to start. Either way, you're going to have an X amount of dollars on how much you want to spend. You're going to have a budget. And to help you gather all the PC parts and see exactly what you need for the PC build, I use a tool called PC Part Picker. A lot of people do too. It can also alert you of some compatibility issues with your build, so that's also helpful, but sometimes not 100% right, which I know some parts work together, but it's also a good tool to use to just kind of like let you know if there may be compatibility issues, and also it's a good list of what each component you need and to pick each one to kind of like list and plan your PC build. All right, so the first part I usually choose is the CPU, and the CPU is basically kind of like the engine in your computer, basically processes tasks, and so the more cores it has, the more it's able to do all at once, and the faster speeds it has, obviously the faster your computer is able to complete those tasks. So when looking for a CPU, usually I kind of ask yourself, what are you going to do with the PC? So if you're gaming, you're probably going to want to look for high speed, since most games don't utilize all the cores on your CPU. If you're being productive, you don't need the most cores, you don't need the fastest CPU, basically you're just kind of doing standard tasks. And if you're doing high performance, now if you're doing like 3D rendering, or if you're doing like video editing or anything like that, you want to probably look for more cores because you want to get a lot done all at once. It's basically like having multiple CPUs on one chip. So what you want to look for is you want to look for cores, you want to look for speed, you want to look for cache, you want to look for socket type, and then features. So cores, if you're gaming, you don't need a whole lot of cores. When gaming, single core speed matters more, and then speed is measured in gigahertz. So the more the better. Cache is super fast memory that holds frequently used data used by the CPU. So you usually see like L1, L2, and L3, L1 being the fastest, and the more the better. So socket type, just take note of this because AMD and Intel have different socket types, and also different generations have different socket types. So it will depend on what motherboard that you need to get. All right, on to features. So if you want to overclock it, Intel, you're going to have to basically get one that ends in a K, and that means it's unlocked and you're able to overclock it. All AMD CPUs are unlocked and you're able to overclock them by default. If you get an Intel CPU that is locked and you're not able to overclock it, basically it does not have a K at the end. So now on to integrated graphics, meaning that your CPU basically displays the graphics if you don't have a GPU. So Intel by default, it has an iGPU, or it's integrated graphics. But if you see Intel CPU that has an F at the end, then that means it does not have graphics and you need a dedicated GPU. AMD by default does not have integrated graphics. So if you do need integrated graphics on an AMD CPU, they call it an APU. Then you're looking for a G at the end of the CPU, and that has the graphics that you need. The second part I usually choose when building a PC is RAM. And now RAM is basically short-term memory used while the PC is running, and applications use this. So if you have a lot of applications at once, you're going to look for more RAM or more capacity. So what you're looking for with RAM is you're looking for capacity, you're looking for DDR or double data rate, you're looking for frequency, you're looking for CAS latency, and whether or not you want RGB or not. So capacity is measured in gigabytes, and if you're gaming, the minimum amount of RAM that I would get is about 16 gigabytes. Now if you have a lot of applications open at once, you're probably going to want more, so the higher the better. The second thing you're going to look for is DDR or double data rate, and this is the generation of RAM. So basically the newest one right now is DDR5, and so when you're looking at RAM, you'll see like a DDR4-3200, and that's the generation of RAM. Frequency is measured in megahertz, and obviously higher is better, but when you're gaming, higher frequencies don't really impact the games that much. A lot of people use this measurement to determine speed, but actually speed is determined by other factors, like the fourth thing I look at, which is CAS latency. So CAS latency is basically how long the computer has to wait before it can read data from the memory. It's basically a delay. The smaller number, the better or faster. You usually see this number at the end of you'll see something like DDR4, 3200, CL14. So just because you see RAM with a higher frequency and a higher CAS latency number doesn't make it faster. For example, if you see like RAM that's DDR4 3200 CL14, and then you see one that's DDR4 3600 but CL16, if you look these up on the RAM latency table or a calculator, you'll actually notice that this DDR4 3200 CL14 is faster. I'm going to provide those two links to some tools that you can kind of determine what RAM is faster by looking at the frequency and the CAS latency, RGB or not. You know, you can save some money if you don't do RGB. But if you have RGB, does it increase FPS? One DDR5 stick is dual channel, so really you only need 2 sticks. One thing to note with RAM, you don't want to mix match different brands and frequencies when adding or piecing together RAM kits. You want to keep them all the same. The next thing I look for is the motherboard, and basically it holds all the parts and allows everything to talk to each other. So the things I look for are the CPU socket, if it has BIOS flashback or not, PCIe version, if it supports my M.2, if it has I/O, enough like maybe USB ports in the back, Wi-Fi. I'm looking for the support the RAM speeds, make sure it's compatible, and then if I'm able to overclock my CPU. So with CPU socket, obviously if you chose an AMD, you probably chose like it either is an AM4 or an AM5 is the latest one, so you want to get a motherboard that has that. Intel, the latest one, like the 12th and 13th generation CPUs, are an LGA 1700. So BIOS flashback, this will allow you to update your BIOS without a CPU or some other parts. So basically all you need is power to the motherboard and a USB stick that's supported and with the latest BIOS file on it. Most motherboard manufacturers have what's called the BIOS flashback button, except Gigabyte, they call it the Q-Flash Plus. Now make sure that Plus is important, because if it's just Q-Flash, you still have to go into BIOS and then you update the BIOS from there. This motherboard feature is not a requirement, but it just makes life a lot easier. So if you don't have the BIOS flashback button and you get like an older, cheaper motherboard with a newer CPU, sometimes what you'll have to do is you'll have to update the BIOS to get up to be able to support the CPU. Now sometimes out of the box it will be able to support that, you'll just see it on the box. But if not, then you'll have to get an older CPU to update the BIOS. So either from a friend, a store can do that. If none of these options work, AMD has a boot kit. Basically, they'll send a CPU out so you can update your BIOS this way. Just makes life a lot easier when you have the BIOS flashback button. The other thing I look at on a motherboard is PCIe version. PCIe are lanes that act as information highways that which it communicates through. It is backward and forward compatible, so in like 2023 right now, you'll see PCIe 3.0, 4.0, and 5.0 is the newest. I try to keep my PCIe versions across my components all the same, but technically you can run a PCIe 3.0 GPU, for example, on a PCIe 4.0 motherboard. Sometimes you might have to just go into BIOS and switch that to run on 3.0, but they are compatible. The other thing I look at is M.2 support on the motherboard. So if you plan on getting an M.2 drive, like an NVMe, you want to make sure that you have at least 1 or 2 of these on the motherboard. You want to make sure the motherboard supports them, and it has them, obviously. Other thing you can look at is the I/O or on the back of the motherboard, like how many USB ports it has, or if it has like a USB-C, if that's important to you and you need to be able to plug stuff like that in. Wi-Fi. So if you need Wi-Fi, you won't be able to plug an Ethernet cable and you want Wi-Fi, you can get a motherboard that has integrated Wi-Fi that you just plug in the antenna. You can also, if your motherboard doesn't have it, you can also just get a USB Wi-Fi device that plugs in through USB. Another thing I look at is it supports my RAM and generation. So basically the generation, so if you have chose a DDR4 RAM sticks, you want to make sure you get a DDR4 board, because DDR4 and DDR5 are different. They won't fit. And you want to make sure it supports the speeds. Another thing that's important, if you want to plan to overclock, make sure you get a motherboard that supports overclocking. There are some cheaper motherboards that don't allow overclocking. For example, a B760 does not allow overclocking, but a Z790 does. All right, the next component I look at is the GPU, and obviously this provides the graphics. And so this is most important when gaming, obviously. This is probably the most expensive part of your PC build. And so usually what I do is kind of allocate about 30 to 50% of my total budget to the GPU, because these are a lot more expensive. I'm not going to go in detail of like each GPU brand and all the features every GPU has. This is more of a higher overview and just building a compatible PC. Some people think that just because you chose an AMD CPU, you need to do like maybe an AMD GPU. Well, that's not true. So it doesn't matter what CPU, AMD, Intel, you can still run an AMD GPU, Intel GPU, or NVIDIA GPU. What I do suggest is you choose a CPU and a GPU combo that are kind of comparable, like the tier level. Obviously the CPU, you're not going to get a low level 13100 Intel, and then you're going to maybe get like a 4090. Low level CPU is going to bottleneck that GPU. So kind of stay within somewhat of a different tier level. So if you want to do low end, kind of do low ends, high ends, and then kind of the middle. So what I usually look for in a GPU is the PCIe version, the physical size, and then also some other specs like VRAM and core clock and all that stuff. The PCIe version, we talked about this with RAM, and usually what I like to do is keep the same PCIe version as my motherboard. So if I get a PCIe 5 or PCIe 4 motherboard, typically you're probably going to do like the same GPU, but that will work. Different generations are forward, backward compatible. With size, physical size, what I usually do is just kind of take note of it, because if you're buying like a 4090, a big beefy GPU, this will matter later, like when you get a case. You want to make sure it fits. Other specs I usually look at is the core clock speeds, the VRAM size, and VRAM speed, but this doesn't really matter about the compatibility of your whole PC build. It's just something I look at, and obviously the higher the better with speeds. Core clock speed is the measure of how fast your graphics processor processes graphics.
You got through it.
Nice. Yes. A GPU has dedicated VRAM or video RAM, and this is similar to your system RAM, but it works a little differently. Having more VRAM allows you to store more graphics or textures, and so obviously higher the better. So the VRAM speed, or the memory clock speed, allows you to process these graphics or textures a lot quicker. So obviously the higher the better. So the faster that these can render, making your games maybe a little smoother. And there's a lot of other features, like I said, I'm not going to talk about, because you can get into DLSS, ray tracing, and all that stuff, but these don't matter about the compatibility of your PC build, so I'll leave it up to you to do the research on the different features that these GPUs have. Next thing I look at is storage, and obviously this stores everything. So you have stores the operating system, stores applications, games, files, pictures, all that stuff. The different types are NVMe, which is the fastest right now, and then the second fastest is the SSDs, and then the third fastest, which is HDD, which is a spinning hard drive. So the things I'm looking for with storage, I'm looking for the type, and I'm looking for capacity, and looking for speed. So the type is, you can do an NVMe, like I mentioned before. Typically these are fairly reasonably priced, so I usually get an NVMe, and then so what you do is you want to make sure that you have an M.2 slot on your motherboard. So the second thing I look at is capacity, and so right now what I usually do, I recommend something that's about 500 gigs or higher. You can do something lower, like a 256 gig, but if you install Windows on it, you're looking at Windows takes about 60 gigs. If you want to install software, games are really large these days, so usually you want to have some free space, and you want to max everything out. Usually I recommend keeping about 10 to 20% free. So many different ways of doing this. So you can run everything all on the NVMe. You can get one 1 terabyte or 2 terabytes, and then you can store everything on there. Pro move, if you actually partition that NVMe, basically you set the chunk to like maybe Windows operating systems, and then leave a little space for applications or anything like that, and then you have storage on maybe a separate drive that's partitioned off. Another way you can do is NVMe and then SSD combo. You can do the OS and the applications maybe on NVMe, and then use the SSDs for some storage. The third way you can also do it is if you have like an NVMe or SSD running kind of like the applications in the operating system, and then you have longer term storage like hard drives, HDD. HDDs are good for longer term storage. You can store files and pictures on there. I usually have a couple of these, like 4 terabyte ones. It stores all my pictures, stores all my videos and all that stuff for longer term storage. So the third thing I look at is speeds, and so like when I'm comparing maybe different NVMe types and brands, I look for the different read-write speeds. Obviously the higher the better. The next thing I look at is the PSU, and obviously this provides all the power to the parts. The things I look at for a PSU are the wattage, the rating, the PSU tier list, whether or not the PSU is fully modular or not, and the size. So for wattage, I want to make sure I have enough power for everything, and then some headroom. I want to have more than what I'm actually consuming. And so basically especially if I'm overclocking, I want to make sure that I have more power, because you're actually bumping up power. A good tool to use is the Outer Vision's power supply calculator. I'll leave a link down in the description for that. So for rating is basically how efficient it is. The minimum PSU rating that I usually do is an 80 plus gold, but you can do a little bit lower if you want to save a little bit more money, like an 80 plus bronze or higher. But basically with a better rating, like an 80 plus gold or higher, you're going to have better things like better capacitors, better rail design, and obviously you want to have something that's really going to provide some good power and going to be efficient for all your components. Next thing I look at is a PSU tier list, and this is a list of PSU ratings, being tier A being the best PSUs, all the way down to like a tier C and below. I wouldn't get anything that's below a tier C. There are three types of modular PSUs. We have a non-modular, and this one is basically where all the cables are already connected and you can't remove them. These are still great PSUs, they're just usually cheaper, and so if you're on a budget, you can choose a non-modular PSU. The only thing I don't like about it is if you're not using a cable, you can't just remove it, so it's kind of hard to like cable manage and tuck away some of those cables that aren't being used. The second type is a semi-modular, and basically it has some of the common ones that are connected, and then they have other options to insert cables that you want to use. And the last type is a fully modular power supply, where basically there are no attached cables. Just plug in whatever cable you need. This makes it easier if you want to cable manage because you only have the cables that you're using. These are usually more of the expensive PSU option because of this. And the fourth thing I look at is size. Most of them are just kind of like a standard size, but if you're doing a mini ITX build, like a small build, then you may want to take a look at getting, a small form factor PSU. Next thing I look at is a case, and basically this is a kind of a contained environment that holds everything, obviously, and it controls the airflow that you want to be able to cool off your components. So what you want to look for with a case, you want to basically make sure that it supports the size of motherboard that you have. Does it include fans or not? How's the airflow? Will it support the GPU size? Will it support the radiators or AIO? So the first thing, to make sure that it supports your motherboard. So basically you don't want like a big motherboard, like an EATX, and then like a smaller case, because obviously a smaller motherboard will fit in a bigger case, but not vice versa. So the different types of motherboards that you have that it fits is like an EATX, extended ATX, normal size ATX, then you got the micro ATX, and then you got a mini ITX. Second thing I usually look at is if it's includes fans or not, but usually that's not a big requirement. Only if you probably want to save some money and you want included fans, like with our small budget gaming PC, I want to make sure that included fans. Usually that fans are included with the cases are usually a cheaper fan because they kind of expect that you'll either swap them out or they're looking to maximize their profits and they'll just throw like a cheaper fan in there and just kind of, at least it gives you some airflow. Third thing I look at is airflow. Does this case have good airflow? So you want to take a look at usually the front of the case and the bottom. You want some good airflow to have intake, bring cold air in, and then the back and the top, you want good exhaust. Usually that's exhausting the hot air. So you want to look at the case to see if it has like good ventilation. It's not just flat and it'll suffocate and make the inside of the PC really hot. So you want to make sure that there's slots. You want to read reviews to make sure that airflow is good. Fourth thing is, will it support my GPU? Obviously, if you get a big 4090 or something like that, you want to get a case that supports that big size GPU size. Fifth thing is, does it support radiators? Does it support my AIO? Does it support the radiator where I want to mount it, like in the front or the top? Does it support a 240, 280, 360? Another thing I look at with a case is I want to read reviews. I want to see is it made of cheap materials. I've built some bad cases that are just horrible. They're just flimsy. The case is not good quality. It's bad cable management. So just read reviews and see how the case holds up. So the next thing I look at is a CPU cooler. So CPU gets really hot like an engine, you want to cool it off. There are three different types of cooling. So you can do an air cooler, you can do an AIO or an all-in-one, or you can do a custom loop water cooling. If you're doing air cooling and you get a CPU that includes a stock cooler, maybe if you're saving money and you want to get an air cooler that is included with the CPU, you can do that. But this is kind of like the bare minimum. I mean, it does its job, but it doesn't always cool the best. So if you want something to upgrade, I would recommend prioritizing some money to upgrade your air cooler. You want to keep that CPU nice and warm, nice and cool. You want to keep that CPU nice and cool. So if you can, I would upgrade to a better air cooler, like an aftermarket one, where basically it has a better air cooling, like Noctua, or something that's a little bit beefier that cools it a little bit better than the stock one. Next one is an AIO or an all-in-one, where basically it kind of like a closed loop water cooling, and so it has the pump that you put right on the CPU. So water flows across the CPU and it goes up the tube into the radiator where the fans are attached and cools off that water, that coolant, and then it goes back down, the cooler coolant goes back down and runs across that CPU again and kind of cools it off into a continuous loop, like a closed water or coolant loop. Usually I choose an AIO based on the case I want, so make sure that it supports, what size of AIO that I get, either the front if I want to mount on the front, or if I want to mount on the top, make sure that case supports that AIO. The third thing you can do is like a custom loop or a water cooling loop. This is the most expensive, the highest maintenance, the most technical, and that's basically where you're piecing together your own cooling, where you're getting the different radiators, you're getting a CPU block, maybe a GPU block, you're getting a pump, a reservoir combo, you're doing fittings and tubes, you're doing everything. This is pretty technical. Another PC component that I look for is if I need any additional fans. If your case doesn't come with fans, then you'll need to get some extras to be able to cool and to control the airflow in your PC. You want to make sure that you have intake or bring in cool air in from the front, or if you have a case like the Leo 11D, the side or the bottom. So you're bringing cool air from the side, bottom, or the front for sure, and you're moving it through the case and you're exhausting the hot air out the back or out the top. If your case has front fans, you can use those if you don't want to replace them. If you're using an AIO, keep in mind that the AIO comes with fans included. So if you're going to put that in the front or the top too, so you don't need to buy additional fans if you don't want to. You can replace all the fans if you want to keep all the fans the same, but that's, it's going to be more money to replace all those fans. So what I look for is the size. And then if you want RGB, ARGB, or non-RGB, and then fan control or power. So the sizes of fans, usually the common one is a 120 millimeter, or they have a slightly larger 140 millimeter. So the different types of RGB, you have regular RGB, which basically changes the one color of the whole fan, so the whole thing changes. You can do ARGB, which is addressable RGB. So that means you can change individual LED lights on that little strip in there. So you can have some cool effects, and the whole thing, you can have multiple colors on that one fan. If you also see something that says DRGB, it's the same thing as ARGB. And then obviously if you just want non-RGB, if you don't want RGB at all, that's fine too. Third thing I look at is the fan control or power. And so you have a Molex, which is kind of like really basic. That plugs directly into the PSU and that runs at full speed, so it can get kind of loud. There's no fan control or monitoring or anything like that with this. The other thing you might see is a DC. And so this is a 3-pin. It plugs directly into your motherboard header or a fan hub. So with DC, the only way that you can control the fan speed is basically playing with the voltage. And most people don't. You just kind of run it at full speed. And the third one, which is kind of the most common, is a PWM or a 4-pin. And what that is, that 4th pin allows you to control the fan speed. So you can set the fan curves based on your temps. So basically if the temps rise, you can set it to basically have the fan speed ramp up higher and cool it off faster, or you can manually set it as a static one. And just so you know, the 3-pin DC fans and the 4-pin PWM fans, they all plug into the same 4-pin motherboard header or a fan hub. That 4th pin basically just controls the fan speeds. All right, the last thing I kind of look at, and it's optional, it's custom PSU power cables. So if you don't want those ugly power cables that come with the PSU, you can go ahead and upgrade to like some custom ones that are different colors and they're higher quality, they look better. There's 2 different types of custom power cables. There's a full and an extension. So the full ones are obviously a full cable, they plug directly into the component and they plug into the PSU. With this one, you want to make sure that these cables are compatible with your PSU, since different PSUs have different pinouts. The next ones are extensions, and so if you get extensions, they don't need to matter that it's compatible with the PSU or not. So basically they plug in to the default power cable from the PSU, and they are the ones that you'll actually see on the outside. The common cables that are visible that you want to get are the 24-pin on the motherboard. And with the GPU, you want to make sure that you have the different cables or pins that your GPU has, like over the 4090, if it has a special pin or if it has 3 8-pins. And the other cables are the CPU or the EPS cables that will actually be on display on the top of the motherboard to power the CPU. And so with these ones, you can either get just like the 1 8-pin to power the CPU or 1 6-pin, whatever it is. But if you plan on overclocking, or if you have a very power hungry CPU, like maybe a 13900, what I usually do is I kind of max those out on the motherboard. So if you have an 8-pin and a 4-pin, or an 8-pin and a 6-pin, I choose both those cables. Good luck with your build. Hopefully this video was able to help you. Leave any comments down below if I can answer any questions or clarify anything, or if I missed something later.